Welcome back to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director of Denison Forum and host for today's conversation about faith and culture, and today, faith, culture, and science, and how those things weave together and intersect, complement rather than compete with each other. Our guest today is Dr. Tom Rudelius. He completed his undergraduate work at Cornell, earned a doctorate in physics at Harvard, and has conducted postdoctoral research at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Currently a postdoctoral researcher in theoretical physics at the University of California, Berkeley, Tom will begin a faculty position at Durham University in the United Kingdom in the fall of 2023. His research focuses on string theory, quantum field theory, and early universe cosmology. A man of faith and an avid sports fan, he is a frequently requested speaker on topics related to science and faith. He also serves on the board for a tutoring organization in South Africa. We want to welcome Dr. Rudelius to our podcast today. We look forward to an intriguing conversation that we think will help to equip you as you walk with Christ and as you seek to be salt and light for the kingdom of God in your world, in your context. All right, we're welcoming Dr. Tom Rudelius to our podcast, and his recently released book is called Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. Dr. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us about your book. What is the background, the context of what prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, so the book is a memoir. It's really about my journey to faith. I was raised in a very loving but also a very non-religious family. I came to faith in college. And so it's the story of how I came to faith. And it's also the story of my walk as a Christian and as someone in the field of science, and how those two paths of mine have sort of intersected with one another. I think... Well, that's... sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think what kind of motivated me is just this... this desire, I think, to kind of be able to share my story, so that people, I think a lot of people will be able to kind of resonate with maybe not everything from beginning to end, but definitely parts here, for the people who maybe who aren't religious, who don't believe in God, but would like to believe that there's something more, for the people who have been Christians their whole lives, but wrestle with questions about, how to reconcile science and faith. And so that's the hope, is that the reader, wherever they're at, would sort of be able to see a bit of their journey in mine, and be able to kind of walk along that journey with me.
Oh, absolutely. So your story includes, it's kind of encouraging to hear that you came to faith in college. We've heard, maybe not accurately always, but we often hear stories about how young people lose their faith when they get to college. But talk a little bit more about that and how the story, you have a twin brother named Steve, and how Steve's journey became influential in your journey.
Yeah. So as you say, my brother Steve was really the key person in it. I went to Cornell for college. He went to Northwestern, and his freshman year at Northwestern, Steve met a guy on his floor in his dorm freshman year named Matt. And Matt was probably the first really serious Christian that either of us had ever met. And so Steve started having a lot of conversations with Matt, and to make a long story short that you can read more about in my book, Steve decided to become a Christian. And so he tried to talk with me about faith. He tried to give me a copy of the New Testament and some other books about Christianity to read. And I told him, look, Steve, I have trouble finding time to read books that I want to read, much less time to read books that I don't want to read. That was just kind of where I was at with religion. It just didn't seem like the most important thing in my life. And there were other things, school and sports, and trying to make the most of my time in college that just seemed more important to me at the time. But it was really through just kind of having more conversations with him, and just kind of almost just a curiosity to see what was this thing that he had decided was worth devoting his life to. That got me to start going to church with him when we were both home for the summer, just to see what it was like as someone who hadn't really ever, hadn't gone to church more than a handful of times in my life. So started going to church, started having conversations, and eventually I did in fact start reading the books and about Christianity, the New Testament, and so yeah, it was kind of a gradual journey of discovery that led me down that road to where I started learning more, started thinking more, and started recognizing that this actually was something that was important, and it did have implications for how I lived my life. It wasn't something I could just set aside.
Wow, just the power of relational influence, right? Especially those that we know well through our family and our friendships, and just how influential that is. That's a part of my own story, how a good friend of mine, actually two really good friends of mine, when I was in high school, influenced me in the direction of faith, whereas I didn't think it was needed or that important. It seemed like it was pretty confusing and not all that significant. But talk a little bit about this this myth, really, what I've come to term as a myth, which is the incompatibility between science and faith. I've had the opportunity over, I don't know, the last 20 years or so to become familiar with the work of Francis Collins and his testimony, John Lennox, James Tour down at Rice University. All of them, like you, very significant in their scientific discoveries and pursuits and studies. There really are a large number, a significant number of very, very dedicated scientists like you who are also very dedicated in their faith. Mm-hmm. Isn't that the way it really is? It's not like the myth that science and faith are at odds or in some ways competing with each other.
Yeah. I mean, I think, within my field, I guess I see people from lots of, from sort of across the religious spectrum. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's quite a diversity of opinion when it comes to religious beliefs within the field of science. I think that part of the reason why, there's this incompatibility is I think that for a lot of people, there's kind of this understanding that science and religion are offering two just totally separate and incompatible approaches to the same sorts of questions. And, science deals with like data and truth and hard facts, and religion is speculation and sort of mindless conformity. And, don't ask questions, just believe whatever the pastor or priest tells you. And I think when you look at it from that perspective, I'm personally going to pick science every time if that's the choice. And I think most people would, and most people do. But a big part of my own journey of coming to faith and in my journey of sort of rising up the ranks in science is coming to recognize that I think that science and religion really aren't offering two totally different approaches to the same questions. I think they're actually rather similar approaches to rather different questions. That science deals with questions more about mechanisms and how things work, and faith, religion deal more with questions about meaning and purpose and why are we here, and why does anything exist at all. And so I think that for me, something that I found is that I can be a person of faith without having to sort of just turn off my brain and just believe. That the same sort of analytical approach that I take to weighing, arguments in the field of science, dealing with uncertainties there. I think that same approach for me is very similar to how I approach faith. And so ultimately, I think that there isn't really an incompatibility between how these two things work.
Yeah, you did a really great job, I thought, explaining how story and science are really two pathways. Can you talk about that a little bit? In addition to your book, I saw you do a YouTube presentation where I thought this was just so powerful. The reality that there is both the scientific, mechanistic, mathematical side of the world, and there's also the story side of the world. And I thought you really had a great conclusion about which one of those is in the lead, if you will.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, as you say, I think that, and I think this is part of what distinguishes maybe the non-religious from the religious perspective in the world, is that I think that the non-religious often tends to view the world as sort of like this giant mathematical structure, that there are these laws that not only describe reality but actually define reality. And I think that as a theist, what sort of makes the most sense of the world to me is to view it not just as like this mathematical structure with all these laws, but actually as a larger story, some sort of narrative that you and I are characters in. And I think it's not like these things are incompatible, right? I mean, I think it was C.S. Lewis who had this analogy first of if you ask me why is the cup of water boiling, I could give you like a thermodynamic explanation for how like water boils, and I could talk about phase transitions and stuff like that, or I could just say the water is boiling because I wanted to make a cup of tea. And so the same phenomenon, right? The water boiling to make a cup of tea can be analyzed from like a purely mathematical, physical perspective. But then there's also kind of this story component, right? That why am I making the cup of tea? That there's sort of the story and the structure that go along. And as you say, I mean, I think the question of whether theism or atheism for me comes down to the question of is our world ultimately just a structure that's masquerading as a story, that you and I are just like chemicals, and somehow we've gained consciousness, we've gained sentience, and that's just by a total coincidence? Or is there actually something fundamental about this story that we all experience? And so, I think to me, there's a lot of things that seem nice about the world as a story, but there are also some things that are a little bit hard to square. Our story, if we believe in the like astrophysics account of what's going to happen, then someday the sun is going to swallow up the earth and all of us will die, and that will be the end of everything. And so it kind of raises the question of what is the point of this story? What are we just here for a finite time and then we all die out and that's the end of it? So our story seems to need like a point. It needs a climax and it needs a hero. And I think to me, that's where Christianity really makes sense of the world, where Jesus comes into the story as the hero of the human story. He sacrifices himself for the good of the many, rises triumphantly over the grave in the climactic moment of history. And so to me, kind of the Christian story is the last missing piece of the puzzle of our story, of this true story, capital T, capital S, that we find ourselves living in. And so to me, that's kind of the thing that tips the scales. That to me, Jesus just makes sense out of this world, making sense out of questions like, why does anything exist at all? What are we doing here? What's our meaning and purpose in life? And I think the last thing I'll say on this is, I think what I found too, and what I did find back in my days before I was a Christian, is that it's really hard to actually live practically viewing the world as just like this giant mathematical structure. Like it helps to think of it that way when I'm, working as a physicist and I'm trying to figure out, the laws of nature. That there's, it helps to think of it like that. But ultimately, even as a physicist, I have to go home and like live out the story of my life. And I think it's really hard to live consistently with the idea that we're all just chemicals and, that it's all just matter in motion. We're just here by total coincidence, that somehow all of us need to make some sort of larger meaning, some sort of larger story. And I think it's something I really like about Christianity is I think that it allows me to actually live that consistently with the worldview that I profess.
Yeah, great way of explaining it. That sounds like what you mean when you say that Christianity is not just good advice, it's good news. It's this ultimate chapter to the story, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, that was something that was initially very attractive to me is, if Christianity is just good advice, if it's, it's just do this and this is how you have a happy life. It's like, well, do I really need religion for that? I have my teachers, I have my parents, I have lots of people who have given me good advice. But Christianity really comes with something more than that. It comes with a totally different understanding of what the world is that we find ourselves living in. And that's something that, when I realized that's when it kind of became something that I couldn't just ignore. That I can't just go through living life trying to, following good advice, like having this understanding of why is all of this stuff good in the first place? Like what's the purpose? What's the overarching objective that we're all going for? And that was something that, the Christianity, I think, really offers, even compared to other religions, in a rather unique way, that it's mainly about good news rather than good advice.
Yeah. Was that the biggest, or were there other preconceptions about Christianity that you had to work your way through as you were on this journey toward faith?
Yeah. There are a few. I think one that, growing up, as I said, I only went to church a couple of times, but I had a number of friends who, whose parents kind of dragged them along to church every Sunday. And the thing that they all said was that, church is really boring. The church is really boring. That, the Bible is really boring. And so that was something that when I first started reading the Bible, the copy of the Bible that my brother Steve gave me, pretty quickly, I was actually surprised at how interesting and even entertaining I found it. So he gave me just a copy of the New Testament. So I started with the Gospel of Matthew. And already there, I sort of started to see that there was something really, really unique and really compelling and captivating about the figure of Jesus and about the story of Jesus and his life and death and resurrection. And so that was a big thing too, is I started out, I planned to read just a chapter a day of this Bible that he'd given me. But there were times, getting to the end of one of the Gospels where I just couldn't put the book down, where I just read a few at a time. And so that was something that I think was also, so surprising for me to find that the Bible, the Christianity in general and the Bible in particular weren't boring as I expected them to be.
Yeah, that's something similar about our stories. When I was in this same journey, a friend of mine gave me a Bible, put a note at Matthew 1, said, read a chapter a day. Let me know if you have questions. And literally just through unique ways that the story of Jesus just came alive in a way that I never thought that it could or that it would. Part of the uniqueness of your story is that you had an opportunity to go to work for the NSA, for the National Security Agency. That required that you have a polygraph test.
Yeah.
Talk about how that was a unique part of your journey as well.
Yeah. So, so I guess about 6 months or so after I had started reading the Bible, so it was December of my sophomore year of college, I finished reading the New Testament. I had a lot of conversations with Steve. I'd read some other books arguing both for and against Christianity. And I was starting to get to the point where, it seemed intellectually plausible, but it still just didn't seem like something that was maybe worth the investment, I guess, of mine. It still felt like a really big change to go from how I was living to putting God as the main thing about my life. And so I went, and as you said, I had this internship offer from the NSA, and I had to go and take a polygraph. And my feelings towards the polygraph were actually pretty similar to my feelings towards religion, I would say, where I always thought, okay, I'm basically a good person. I haven't done anything seriously wrong. This test is going to be fine. So I went in and, just answered the questions, and I was failing. And pretty quickly I realized with this polygraph that I was going to continue to fail, not only if I was lying, but just if I felt guilty about anything. So for about 4 hours, I had to share everything that I have done wrong in my life, which, by the way, isn't special. This is what an NSA polygraph experience is like. But for me, I guess in that moment, doing it, in the midst of kind of this journey of discovery and learning about faith and learning about God, that in the midst of that, I had this. It kind of hit me that As I shared all these things that I'd done wrong, it kind of hit me that like, hey, I'm actually not such a good person after all. And in that moment, like the message that Steve had been telling me about this God who, who's died to forgive us, that all of us are in need of forgiveness from God, that started to really make sense to me in a way that it hadn't before. I remember actually even one time, like earlier on, having this like debate. It was probably the most heated I got with Steve, where I was trying to argue that like most people are generally good, and he was saying like, no, that's not right. That like all people are like sinful and all people are in need of forgiveness. And I always thought, I'm like basically a good person. But it was when I had to share all of this stuff, it's kind of like, hey, maybe I'm not so good after all. And maybe that probably means that a lot of people, like deep down, there's a lot more brokenness, I guess, to use a Christian word, than I would like to admit. And so that to me was kind of like the moment that pushed me over the edge, that made me realize that this is something that I actually need. And in that moment, this Christian gospel of a God who's come to forgive us, people who are broken, who are separated from God, and in need of forgiveness, that started to make sense to me out of my own life and my own perspective of the world. So for me, that was kind of, it was kind of like maybe the straw that broke the camel's back. It's the moment that I like attribute to my conversion. I would call that my like conversion moment. But it definitely was kind of this combination of a lot of these conversations that I've been having with Steve and all I've been reading and learning. And it kind of just hit me in just the right time, that it made me say, you know what? Okay, that's it. If this isn't God like reaching out to me, kind of giving me that moment, then nothing is. And so for me, that was the moment that I would really say that I started calling myself a Christian. That I started, that I put God on the throne of my life, if you will.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. That reminds me, I can't remember the philosopher who said this, but he said, modern man is not concerned about sin or its consequences. And you can't appreciate the story of Christianity. You can't appreciate the life and work and story of Jesus if you don't understand what your own need is. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about how you've been received in the scientific community since you became a Christian, and even now as you practice your faith and work in some of these really, really significant places. What's been the reception that you've received?
Yeah. And this is something I talk about a little in my book. It's a question. It's like one of the questions that I'm asked the most by Christians, who know that I'm in science. And it's the question I feel like I've never really had a good answer on, because what I realized is just that like the reception has been so varied that it's kind of hard to like have one single answer. Like I've been invited to speak at places, and then the conversation is kind of just like ridiculing religion the entire time. That's pretty rare. Sometimes there are like people who just kind of dismiss religion and don't really want anything to do with it. Sometimes I've had people, other scientists, not even Christians, who have told me that they like really admire my faith. And then I've also run into Christian scientists, and there's kind of like this very much like this bond between us, that we kind of have this like shared scientific experience, but also like this shared religious experience that really like ties us together. So yeah, I mean, I think on the whole, I'd say that I'm pretty. I think I've had a good relationship with my scientific peers. That in general, my work is judged not based on what religious beliefs I have outside of science, but on the quality and the caliber of my work. But yeah, I mean, as I say, I think that there's a pretty wide spectrum of religious beliefs within my field, and so I think that people have figured out pretty well, that this is something that the people we can kind of agree to disagree on that. We can still make progress within the scientific realm.
Should Christians boycott? Is Christian nationalism biblical? should Christians send their kids to public school? We tackled these questions and 7 more in our latest volume of Biblical Insight to Tough Questions. Support the mission of Denison Forum and request our new book today at dfpodcast.org. Well, good to hear and great to have people like you in those environments. Let's talk a little bit about your work. Now, you're going to have to really help a person like me to understand. You focus in the areas of string theory, quantum physics, and early cosmology, which is a mouthful in and of itself.
Yeah.
So take all 3, pick one, help us understand kind of what you do in your day-to-day life working in these areas.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, string theory is maybe like the like flashiest of all of them. Also, probably the most controversial. So I'll explain that for a few minutes, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
String theory is it's an attempt to combine 2 very well established paradigms within modern physics. There's Einstein's theory of gravity, which is called general relativity. And then there's the theory of quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics deals with very small things like atoms and electrons and stuff like that. General relativity, because it's a theory of gravity, it deals with very heavy things. So things like black holes and kind of the universe as a whole, and galaxies and stars and planets and stuff like this. But so both of these paradigms work really well in their own domain of validity. But if you kind of consider an overlapping domain where you have objects that are both very small but also very heavy, very dense, like for instance, if you go to the singularity of a black hole, for instance, the quantum mechanics and general relativity, they kind of don't fit well together. So what that means is that there has to be some sort of additional paradigm, some other theory, which somehow combines the 2 of them. And so string theory, this is where string theory comes in, and this is its claim to fame, is that it's really the best and maybe even the only consistent way to consistently combine quantum mechanics and gravity, general relativity, into a consistent theory of what's called quantum gravity. So string theory, it's called string theory because it says that everything is made up of little strings, things that we used to think of as particles, like electrons or quarks or photons. We used to kind of think of these little particles as points in space. String theory says, no, actually they're extended in one dimension. So they have a length, so we call them strings. And the reason why it's controversial, well, in part is ignorance. In part is because it just doesn't really have any direct experimental verification. So unlike a lot of other areas of science where we have hypotheses that are you develop some theory, you develop some hypothesis, then you test it experimentally. In string theory, there isn't really that experimental verification process. On the other hand, where string theory differs and where like fundamental physics differs from a lot of other areas of science is that the mathematics itself is very tightly constraining. In other words, you can learn a lot about quantum gravity even without direct experimental evidence just by requiring mathematical consistency. It's not easy to put together gravity and quantum mechanics in a consistent way, just like how it's not possible to put together special relativity and quantum mechanics in a consistent framework. So there's a lot, that's kind of a difference, I guess, which makes string theory maybe more plausible and it makes it possible to learn things even without experimental evidence. But it still does raise the question of, is this really science? It's kind of a different approach than most other fields of science take. And so this is why a lot of people who are more accustomed to that approach maybe aren't such big fans of string theory. But anyway, that's kind of what I do. A lot of what I do is focused on trying to connect string theory to experiments to try to bridge that gap and figure out ways to test string theory. But it's a very difficult task. So it's something that we kind of make only incremental progress in every day.
So do those areas lead you toward this area of early cosmology? Is early cosmology talking about the origin of the earth, those kinds of questions that you would typically, if you went to an average church in the United States and had a conversation about science and faith, you know you're going to get the question about, okay, how old is the earth and what about the dinosaurs? My own 5-year-old granddaughter is asking me, okay, where are the dinosaurs in the Bible?
Right.
Is it taking you in that direction? And maybe a broader way to say this is creationism and evolution, are they at odds with each other, or can they be complementary?
Yeah, I guess I think it depends on what the definition of creationism is. But because I think that there are different ways. There's like theistic evolution. There's young Earth creationism. There's old Earth creationism. There's a lot of even within Christianity, and even apart from sort of what science tells us. I think there's like good and interesting and important debates about how to interpret some of these early Genesis texts. Now, my research itself deals with like when I talk about like early universe cosmology, it's like way before like the formation of the Earth. So it's like Big Bang, like 10 to the minus 34 seconds after the universe's beginning, because that's where the energies are high enough that we actually maybe have a hope of testing string theory. So personally, I like subscribe to an old Earth view of the world, and I think that as I said before, I think in general, like faith, religion, the Bible is telling us more about meaning and purpose, and science is telling us more about mechanisms and how God has done what He's done. And so, to me, I think that the questions that I'm, from a scientific perspective, someone who studies cosmology, I think that the questions that I'm looking at in that capacity are the sorts of questions that science is like made to answer. That's the realm where science should be applied. And then I think that, for when I look at the Bible, I think that this is something that's less focused on giving us like a scientific account of creation, a step-by-step process, and more of telling us like what is the meaning of all of this? Why did God create? And really distinguishing that narrative from the narratives of a lot of the other religions of the time. So I guess from my perspective, there isn't an incompatibility necessarily, but I think it depends on how one interprets the science, how one interprets the text, the Bible, and how those things go together.
So as you went down this road, as you continue to go down these roads, oftentimes we get into this kind of a conversation about science and faith, and where they weave together, how they are complementary disciplines, but also different disciplines. Talk about the difference between evidence and proof. Christians who are not as scientifically geared as you are will sometimes get, I think in some ways, errantly down this road about proof, about this proves this or that, especially when it comes to matters of faith. Talk about the distinction between evidence and proof.
Yeah. So, I mean, personally, I pretty much never like to use the word proof, unless it's in the context of like a mathematical proof. And even in mathematics, when we talk about mathematical proofs, I was a math major, by the way, before I became a physicist. I did my share of math proofs and stuff. And even in math, when we talk about proof, we don't mean like 100% certainty. What a mathematical proof means is that the conclusion follows logically from certain axioms. And that's not the same as 100% certainty. I mean, I can guarantee you that there are mistakes in the mathematics literature, right? Even mathematicians make mistakes in their proofs. So when mathematicians and logicians talk about proof, it's not necessarily like 100% certainty. And so I think that's why, for some people, the word proof kind of denotes this 100% certainty. And the reality is that I think we really never have 100% certainty in anything. Every scientific experiment has error bars that are quantifying how much uncertainty do we have, right? How much error is there? And I think that's true for when it comes to questions of faith as well. I think that every debate that we ever have, every theological discussion, every moral discussion, every scientific discussion, there's always going to be some amount of uncertainty, and I think that what we have to do, as a scientist, the goal of science isn't just to avoid uncertainty altogether, or say oh, if there's uncertainty, well, then this is too speculative and this isn't science. Really, science is about trying to quantify, minimize, and navigate uncertainty. And I think that those are the sorts of principles that have really been helpful for me in faith as well, where it's yes, I don't have 100% proof in a lot of the things that I believe when it comes to questions of faith. And I'm not, I would say, I believe in God. I'm not as certain in the existence of God as I am in the existence of gravity or something like that. But at the same time, right, and this is I think the key thing with science, my journey of science has taught me, is just because there's some uncertainty doesn't mean that it's just a total shot in the dark. I think that some of the arguments for the existence of God are really good arguments, and they carry weight. I think some of the arguments against the existence of God are good arguments too, and they carry weight as well. And so part of the journey for me has been learning how to navigate these uncertainties, how to balance the weights, and to figure out what I actually believe, and also to figure out which position makes the most sense from a practical perspective. And so to me, the conclusion I arrive at the end of all of this is I think that Christianity is the most likely worldview, and I think it's definitely practically the most reasonable path for me to follow. I'd much rather give my allegiance to God, to Jesus, than to anything else that I know isn't going to pay off. But yeah, I think I do, like you. I kind of get red flags when people start talking about proof, because I think if one means 100% certainty, I think that's too high of a bar, not only for faith but even for science as well. But I think that doesn't mean that we can't learn anything. We can't have important discussions.
Well, it's refreshing to hear, because at least in the stereotypes, right, and that's what they are, stereotypes, is the idea that scientists don't deal with uncertainty when they actually deal with it all the time. And that's where their pursuits are often directed from, is from places of uncertainty and a desire to understand, a desire to grasp how the world is put together in naturalistic ways, and why does it work the way it works, and where is it likely going from that standpoint. But in this conversation, absolutely, you get back in some ways to, at least on the faith side of this, the core questions around the evidence for the Bible, and how in this conversation do you reconcile scientific realities that we do understand at this point relative to things we see in the Bible, particularly miracles. Talk about your journey on that side of it. How did you come to have confidence in the credibility of the Bible, and that including its stories of things we can't explain, particularly miracles? We hear these stories about Thomas Jefferson, how he took out all of those pieces from his Bible, what's called the Jefferson Bible. Yeah. How did you work your way through that? Yeah, so I think that this is one of the areas that I really saw the most dramatic shift from where I started to where I am today. I remember this was when I started talking with Steve, I started having these conversations, kind of figuring out what I'd believe, because I never really thought about it too much before. But I kind of was okay, I could believe that there's a God of some sort. I could believe that there's some sort of, higher intelligence behind all of this. But I really struggled with this idea of miracles. I liked the idea, or it's I believe in science. I'm a scientific person. How do I believe in miracles? Because to me, miracles were kind of like a breakdown of the laws of nature, and a breakdown of the way that the world is supposed to be. Where I am today is I think what I came to realize, and I think I read this from someone else, but Jesus's miracles shouldn't be understood so much as a breakdown of the laws of nature and a breakdown of the way that the world is supposed to be, but they're actually a restoration of the way that the world is supposed to be. The world isn't supposed to have
evil, and so Jesus casts out demons. The world isn't supposed to have disease and sickness, and so Jesus heals the sick. And the world isn't supposed to have death, and so Jesus raises the dead and ultimately conquers death through his resurrection. And I think where this really gets back to is that thing we were talking about before of structures and stories, where if the world is just some giant mathematical structure, then yes, like miracles don't make any sense, right? Because if the laws of nature is all that exists, then how is anything else going to come in and like break those laws of nature? But what I realize is, it's a little bit circular, because yes, if I assume atheism, if I assume that the world is just some giant, that it's all just math in motion, then yes, miracles just like don't make any sense at all. But Jesus isn't saying, atheism is true and I'm going to do these miracles. Jesus comes in with this whole different understanding of what the world is, that it's not just this mathematical structure, but that is actually this larger story, that there's a God in charge of it. And within that story, right, as I say, that these miracles have a function, they have a purpose. It's not just random breakdowns of the laws of nature. It's that it's actually God restoring his world to the way that it's supposed to be. And so, the difference, is the miracles aren't just accidents. They're actually key, the crucial parts. Paul talks about how, if Jesus hasn't been raised, then our entire faith is in vain, that we're still in our sins. And so I think from that perspective, when you look at it from this perspective of the story, you see in the miracles of Jesus, and especially in his resurrection, this like key miracle, this, I guess what Tolkien called the eucatastrophe, where good miraculously triumphs over evil, that you see in the climax of every great story. From that perspective, I think the miracles of Jesus make a lot of sense. And so we have to look at the world we have to look at it all through the right lens, I think. And when we do that, we say that the miracles are not actually only possible, but even expected. They're the sort of things that we should expect that the God revealed in Jesus would do in these key moments.
As like I said, as indications of God restoring all things, a taste of that and an indication of what Jesus will ultimately do at the culmination of all things.
Amen.
Your book does a great job of helping us to get a fresh handle on what I would call the positive side of doubt, or the embracing of uncertainty. We all have this struggle that we deal with on a daily basis, how life seems to be random. What kinds of doubts and uncertainty are you working through right now? What questions are you moving toward in your journey of faith at this point?
Yeah.
And talk a little bit about how doubt and question is actually a wonderful gift from God.
Yeah. So I guess I think it's useful, and what I found is it's kind of useful to separate like the two categories of doubts. One of them is I've experienced a few seasons in my life of just like terrible, like devastating doubts of just like almost unable to get out of bed in the morning, and what I have come to realize is actually what that is not really doubt. It's really just like mental health issues. It's like anxiety or depression. And so that's the first thing that I want to say, for the people who are in that I think it's easy to believe like, oh man, I'm really struggling. I need answers. And as a good friend of mine told me last time I was going through this, like, dude, if you're literally dry heaving right now, you don't need answers. You need treatment. And so I think that's really the first thing. And I got, that sucks. Like that, I think having experienced like those sorts of doubts, those sorts of fears and anxieties, that just sucks. And I think, for anyone who's doing that, like get treatment, do what you got to do, and feel free to like leave the questions for another time. Now, the second type of doubt, I think, is fortunately I'm not experiencing that first kind right now, thank God. But I think there's a second kind, which is kind of just like the questions, the things that nag at us, the things that bother us, that we feel like, man, I really wish I understood why God did that, or why it was like this. And I think those are the sorts of things that can be like good and helpful, and push us to like new and better ways of understanding God. So for me personally, I think the three like doubts, the three like good arguments against God, I'll say, the ones that have actually, I think there's a lot of really bad arguments out there, right, that you can find online. But there are three that have actually really given me pause. There's the problem of evil and suffering. There's the hiddenness of God, of like, why isn't it more obvious that God is just like, that he just exists? Like, why doesn't he talk to us audibly? Why isn't it clear that he's there? And the other one is the Bible. Like, I love the Bible in some ways. Like, there's so much there that I just love. There's also a lot that really bothers me, reading some of that, the Old Testament laws, reading, God commanding the Israelites to like totally destroy the Canaanites, stuff like that. It's like, yes. Oh man, like what am I supposed to do with this? I think though that, I think a lot of these questions really where I've found the best answers is in Jesus. But somehow like looking at him, looking at who he is, that somehow there just seem to be better answers to these questions than I find anywhere else. And so for me, I like to think at least that these sorts of doubts, these sorts of questions are in some ways the questions that God wants us to ask. That he wants us to ask these things because ultimately they're going to point us to him. And I think you especially see that with the problem of evil and suffering. It's been called the rock of atheism. It's something that atheists have and theists and Christians and everybody alike has wondered for millennia is, where is God in the midst of all this suffering? And I think it's something that's really special and compelling about Christianity to me is the way that Christianity really makes this like the main point of the entire Bible from the very beginning, with Adam and Eve rebelling against God and evil and sin entering into the world, to the psalmist asking like, why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide your face in times of trouble? All the way through to Jesus and healing the sick, to Revelation where the Apostle John like foresees a future day where all tears are wiped away from all faces and evil and pain and suffering and death is no more. That I think that really God wants us to ask this question from page 1 of the Bible of God, where are you in the midst of suffering? So that someday we can, we eventually will get to Jesus and we see that this is where God is in the midst of suffering, that he's suffering alongside us. So I think that a lot of these questions that were, it's not like God wants us to just not ask questions and believe. I think that these are the doubts that God has given us, that he's given us these puzzles, these mysteries, precisely because they're the mysteries that will point us back to him.
Yeah, well, that's great insight as well. And I think all of us are struggling with those same three kinds of questions. On the second one, why isn't God more obvious? I've just kind of come to the conclusion, at least for now in my mind, that God doesn't make himself more obvious so that he's giving me room to believe. If he was more obvious, he could become so obvious that we'd have no choice. It would be just required that we believe. And he's giving us room in order to do that. But I think you're right. I think we're all struggling with those same kinds of questions. And in a world that seems at times very chaotic and sometimes just downright evil, it can be really challenging. You're moving into a new opportunity in life by moving to Durham University. What will you be focusing on there? So I'll be starting my first faculty position there. I'm a postdoc at Berkeley right now, but in September I'll be starting a faculty position as a professor at Durham University. I'll mainly be continuing my research in string theory, in quantum field theory, early universe cosmology, but then I'll be doing a bit of teaching, probably some graduate classes, some undergraduate classes in physics and math. Fantastic. Well, Dr. Tom, thank you for taking some time to talk to us today about your work and about your book. Again, folks, it is Chasing Proof, Finding Faith by Dr. Tom Rudelius. You can also find him on YouTube. Some great presentations there. Dr. Tom, a last word before we go that you'd like to share with folks.
Oh boy, I wasn't ready for this. But I think I'd just like to say thanks for having me on. I hope people will enjoy my book and be able to resonate with my story.
Well, thanks again for being a part. And we want to thank our Denison Forum audience. If this has been helpful to you, please rate, review us on your podcast platform. Share it with friends and family so that they can be a part of the conversation as well. And we're grateful for your time with us today. God bless you. We'll see you next time on the Denison Forum podcast.